But yeah, this week I was starting to look at Genesis chapter 4, and I think we've got a really exciting note. Just because there was a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know before, and didn't notice before. I thought I might just start by recapping some of the things that kind of circles Genesis 4. So in Genesis 5, we don't have time to go into it in depth, but if you look at Genesis 5, it's basically starting the first genealogy. And it's really interesting because Greg cottoned onto this as well. He sent me a text about it. Is every name in that list actually has a meaning. So Adam means man. And there's been a few people who have been working to just show you what it looks like when you put all the names of everyone together. So the names that are in Genesis 5 are Adam, Seth, Enos, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And look at what it says when you read the meanings of all their names. It actually turns into a sentence. Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort. How crazy is that? So that's the meaning of every name in the genealogy. Who's ever read those genealogies thinking, why am I reading this?
Yeah. I've often read them and thought, there has to be a reason why they're here.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand that they're,
for historical reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You know, 1,565 years had passed between Adam and Noah, but that is really also prophetic. So prophetic. It just blew me over. When I first heard it, I go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's really true. Because I didn't know, and I looked around and I go, yeah. Looks like it is. Talking about Jesus' death.
So when you're reading Genesis 5, like some of my favourite ones, Methuselah means his death shall bring. So Methuselah is like, because he's the oldest person in the Bible as well, the longest living person recorded, and the grandfather of Noah, and it's like, his death is going to bring some interesting stuff. So you've got that. Hey Tim, how's it going? All good? So we were just talking about in Genesis 5 the genealogy and what the names mean. And when you put everyone's names together, it actually forms a sentence. And so Adam, Seth, Enos, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah reads, man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort.
Oh, wow, that's pretty cool.
Super cool. And then wedging on the other side of Genesis 4, we've got Genesis 3, which we looked at last week. And I think the big thing that needed to be unlocked from the salvation story point of view is when the Lord talks to the serpent. The woman said, the serpent tricked me. Verse 14. Yes, verse 14 and 15. So the Lord God spoke to the serpent. He said, because you have done this, you are set apart from all livestock and all wild animals. I am putting a curse on you. You will crawl on your belly. You will eat dust. So remember that dust is a symbol of death. And we looked at that symbolism of the serpent in ancient Egypt. The serpent was always on the Pharaoh's crown, raised to attack. And so saying you're crawling on your belly is about, no, you have no power. You're not in an attack position to kill my children. You're pushed down to the ground. And that's where we get that phrase, the devil is under my feet. It's a prophetic way of saying, the devil isn't able to attack because of what God has said. He is pushed to the ground. So he's in a submissive position, not in an attacking position. And then verse 15, I will make you and the woman hate each other. Your children and her children will be enemies. And in the King James, it talks about her seed. In this version, it says her son. I just realised I've got my phone on Easy Read translation because I was doing a Bible study at Dale. So I've got the super easy read version on by accident. Your children and her children will be enemies. Her son will crush your head and you will bite his heel. And that's prophetic, talking about what Jesus will do on the cross. Yeah. He will crush Satan and Satan will bite Jesus on the heel. That's talking about Jesus will have to die and Jesus will have to sacrifice himself. So when we're reading chapter 4, we're actually wedged between two big prophecies. Chapter 5 is this huge prophecy saying that Jesus is going to come. And then 3 verses 14 and 15 is another prophecy saying that Jesus is going to come. So when it comes to questions like who was Cain's wife, why was Cain's sacrifice bad, these kinds of questions, I think that seeing it in this context is really going to revolutionise the way we read this story, because I think it's actually talking about something profound on a spiritual level. So the first thing I wanted to pick up on is verse 1. So in verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, it says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. One second, I'm just going to change that to the Bible that I use for Bible study, just because that's messing with my head. Oops. And Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. So I really like this wording, saying, I have gotten a man from the Lord. In chapter 3, we've got God has promised to Eve, your seed is going to overcome Satan. And then the first thing Eve says is, I've gotten a man from the Lord. So some theologians make the argument that perhaps Eve thought that Cain was the saviour.
Yeah, I haven't read that.
Yeah.
John Wesley, I think, felt that way.
Yeah. Other people thought maybe Cain was, as the firstborn son, maybe he was meant to do something significant. But whatever the case is, Eve is already looking for the saviour in verse 1. And think of that as life is looking for a saviour. Who thinks that's really interesting?
My version says, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Which is also an interesting way of phrasing it.
With the help of the Lord.
Yeah, I saw that.
Because you know,
Mm.
if we assume there were other people, she would have known maybe how other babies were born, and you know that
Mm.
you didn't need the help of the Lord. to have the
Yeah.
baby. I don't know.
Yeah. Because it is kind of like, well, you see, it's a natural part of creation. Like,
Yeah.
and it's like, is she talking about something spiritually here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read too that I have gotten a man from the Lord actually means possession,
Yeah, okay.
and that Cain's name actually means possession, and that's where they got that idea from. That
Mm.
she thought this is the Messiah,
Mm.
but obviously she was wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder what we're meant to get from that. How often do we see false messiahs? And how often do we follow false messiahs? How often do we falsely identify something as coming from God?
Well, look at Adolf Hitler.
Yeah. Well, this is a good point. We were talking in our history class today about how the evangelical church was very strongly supportive of Hitler. And it's kind of, in hindsight, it's like, how could you? But I think as humans, that's the sort of thing that we tend to do. Look at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. These people who understood the Old Testament rather back to front, didn't even realise Jesus was God.
It's just like it's a theme all the way through the Old Testament. It's like they're always looking for a king, for a saviour, for a Messiah. Like, you
Yeah,
know, it's a thing that they're always looking for.
and when the real thing comes, they deny it, so they accept the false.
Because we try to create in our own minds an image of what it should be.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very true. And you also made that comment, we were talking about one way to read the first 3 chapters is in Genesis 1 where it says, and God made man. Whether we read that as the historical man, Adam, or whether it's talking about God made humankind. And so that's another huge discussion that comes off of that. And I want to draw our attention to verse 2. It says, and she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And I was reading an article about this because the traditional way that I've always been taught is that the reason Cain's sacrifice was bad was because he brought vegetables and Abel brought a lamb which represents Christ. But reading a little further, I was reading some people who were talking about, but think about how the first Hebrew people would have read that, because all the way through Leviticus there's all these sacrifices that involve food, because there's the grain offering where you sprinkle the grain on the altar and it raises up something to God. There's first fruit offering where you take the first plant from your, and there's lots of times in the Old Testament where food is actually used as an adequate sort of sacrifice. So I think we still have to ask, why was Cain's sacrifice not so great? So I think the prophetic side is one side of it, but I read an article that completely blew my mind, which is, let's actually look at the actual text surrounding it. So if we look at Genesis 3, verses 17, it says, the Lord God said to Adam, you listened to your wife's suggestion, you ate fruit from the tree I warned you about. I said you must not eat its fruit. So I am putting a curse on the ground because of what you did. All the days of your life you will have to work hard. It will be painful for you to get food from the ground. You will eat plants from the field, even though the ground produces thorns and thistles and prickly weeds. You will have to work hard and sweat a lot to produce the food you eat. Reading it from, Dad, could you just read that from the King James?
Yeah, verse 17.
17, yeah.
And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field.
So a big part of that, verse 19, to produce the food you eat, there is a curse which is about working the field. You have to work the field to make a living. And look at what Cain does for a living. He works the field. And so there's a symbol here, which I think we miss, is that Cain is under the curse. He represents being under the curse, because God has just said the curse is you have to work the ground, you're going to have to sweat, you're going to have to grow food as part of your curse for sin. And Cain represents that curse. Meanwhile, what does Abel represent? Abel is the keeper of sheep. Abel is the shepherd. And who are the shepherds in the Old Testament and in the New Testament? Well, the good shepherd is Jesus. Jesus is the shepherd. And we look at all of the major leaders in the Bible. You know, Moses was herding sheep when he saw God. David was a shepherd. How many people are described as shepherds in the Bible that were meant to be holy leaders? And if we take it, Greg pushed on it already. Cain, the word Cain can mean two things. Can mean spear or possession or possessed. So we have this picture of, you know, someone who is possessed, someone who is owned, not by God, who is under this curse, who is tilling the ground. Whereas Abel, the word Abel means breath, and it can also mean vapour, so as in something that's going up to God. And so you have this picture of Abel is what we were meant to be. It's this breath that's going up to God. It's this holy sacrifice. It's relationship with God. And Cain is representing what we've wound up with. We're under this curse. And from now on, we are under this curse. And when it comes to God accepting Abel's sacrifice, I think God is showing us what he wants for us. He accepts Abel's sacrifice because he wants us to be enveloped in his breath and in his vapour. He wants us to be connected with the Lamb of God. He doesn't want us to be what Cain is, who is under the curse. And the fact that Cain has brought to God this symbol of the curse, that's the problem. That Cain has come up to God with this symbol of being cursed, and God's like, that's not what I want for humanity. That's not what the big picture is. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground. So he brought from the curse, he brought an offering to the Lord. And Abel, he also brought the firstlings of his flock. Abel brings the first fruit, which is pointing to Jesus, because the firstling of the flock, that's a first fruit. And of the fat thereof, which is which also represents Jesus. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. Who thinks that's an amazing image?
Yeah, that was an analogy.
Mm.
When I was dwelling on it earlier in the week, I didn't quite get as far as you did with the conclusion, but I did see the symbolism of the soil being death.
Yes.
And the sheep relating to Jesus, and that's what they're about. But also the offering from the soil came first, and then came the sheep. So that possibly also has some symbolism.
Yeah, I thought that is interesting because Cain brings an offering first, but God acknowledges Abel first.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is in the book of Leviticus, the festival of first fruits is meant to foretell Jesus rising from the dead. And I think it's really interesting that Abel has got the first sheep. I think that's really important key to helping us understand that it's representing Jesus.
Yes. Oh, what I got from that a long time ago was that the power of the blood.
Yes.
Even showing back then the power of the blood, that of the cleansing power and the forgiving power of it, and God is not happy with anything else but that. And it's kind of like an analogy of Christ's death.
Yeah. The other thing about Cain is he brought some of the fruits.
Yes.
Yes.
Some of the fruits,
and
that's
not
true.
necessarily even first fruits.
Yes. That's also true.
So he probably held back.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah, of the fruit. So that's not all the fruit.
of the fruit. Yeah.
Not all the fruit.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I didn't realise that.
Yeah.
Of the fruit, not all the fruit.
And then it says, or my translation says, the best of the firstborn lambs. So it's like he's not only gotten, like, I'm sure there would have been a lot of firstborns, but he got the best of those compared to Abel, who has just gotten some of his collection.
Yes.
You're like, this will do.
Yeah.
No, nothing but the best.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, the next one that really hit me is in, actually, I'll make sure I haven't skipped anything. Verse 7, when Cain is saying, you know, what's going on? Why are you, and God's like, why are you angry? And it's the phrase, in my Bible, it says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. So if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door.
That is an amazing statement, that.
Yeah, sin lieth at the door, or the other one I've, in the easy to read translation, sin is waiting at your door.
Mine says crouching.
Crouching, yeah. Sin is crouching at the door.
And that might be why, was it Jude or James? So it's not to beware of the way of Cain.
Yeah.
That's kind of like in the New Testament. I know you've seen it written. Be aware of the way of Cain.
So,
which means they believed in this.
So, one of the, I found a quote by a guy named Gary Anderson, and we often think of sin as just missing the mark, which it is missing the mark, it's stuffing up, And we've talked about the difference between individual sin and original sin, that there's original sin, which is because of Adam and Eve's sin, our world is stuffed up. And because of original sin, we get sick, we are imperfect, and it's all those things about our world that is imperfect. And then individual sin is about the rebellion side of it. But Gary Anderson said, sin is more than just a crime against God. It is a burden to be borne. And sin is a debt that needs to be repaid. And I thought, this idea of sin waiting at the door, I think about how would that hit your first century Jewish people. What does that look like for your first century Jewish people? Because in your Jewish homes, what happens when you go into your house? When you go into the house, you have the, is it called the mitzvah? Mitzvah. And it's at the front of the door that you have this blessing to God. And it's like, you know, blessing when you go in, blessing when you go out. So before you enter your house, there's this concept of a spiritual awareness of what you're bringing into your house. And I think the saying, sin is waiting at the door, it's kind of like if you're not going to bring the right sacrifice to God, if you're not bringing the right intention to God, and if you're staying under the curse, then you're bringing that into your house. You're bringing that into your household and onto your family and onto yourself. And I was thinking about this concept of, you know, what's on our door? Are we spending time reflecting with God and having that, you know, that able spirit of, Lord, I'm trying my best to bring you my first fruit, and I know that I am sinful, but I am aware of your son's sacrifice. That's bringing something very different into your house.
Yeah, it is.
And yeah,
sorry,
no, you go.
It just occurred to me about the word waiteth. Well, ETH on the word makes it plural.
Yeah.
Waits. And normally, what does a person do when they're waiting at your door?
And knocking at the door. Yeah, that's a good image.
Waiting for you to come. And I was thinking what James said. He said sin is the transgression of the law, which is a little bit stronger than just missing the mark. And I thought, it's like the Pandora box type story, isn't it? You know, it's sin is laying at the door. As soon as you open it, all this sin and horrible stuff is coming into your house that you really don't want.
And then also thinking about what has happened to humanity is that sin is knocking at the door of humanity.
Yes.
It's trying to get into humanity, because when we look at verse 8, we've got Cain, so think of possessed, and the spear was talking with Abel, so talking with breath, and he slew Abel. So we talked about in chapter 2 and 3, what does it mean when we have a story about man, Adam being man and Eve being life. So we have a story about man and life and how humanity and life has been destroyed. And here we have a similar retelling, a similar thing happening, where literally breath is being snuffed out. That breath of God is being destroyed.
No more life.
No more life, yeah. And it's this image of, it's more than just a story about how we are stuffed up people. It's a really explicit story about our own human condition, about how, you know, we have our own sin, and because of that, it snuffs out God. And it creates a gap between us and God. And what I love is that even in this chapter, there's a solution. And it comes down to verse 13, talking about that burden. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. And I think to myself, this is us as humans. The punishment is greater than I can bear. The punishment of sin, I can't repay that. I can't do that burden. And I think about how many times I've taught the story of Cain and Abel in primary school and never and never gone into the depth of the message that is there.
Do you mind if I just
yeah, go for it.
Go back into verse 7. At the end of verse 7, it says, sin, its desires to have you, but you must master it. So it kind of indicates to me, and when you look back at what Cain did, you must make the choice.
Yes.
About what you're going to bring to God.
And I feel that's very like preachy. That's talking to us today.
Yes.
We have to make the choice.
Yes, there is a choice.
It's like bringing back to the guard your heart, guard your mind
yes.
kind of thing.
Yes.
Like I feel like that's a big link to that. Like mine says, sin's crouching at the door, eager to control you, but you must subdue it and be its master.
Yeah.
So that's like,
it's not like we just sin's going. We're victims of sin.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. We have a role to play here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like a wall slap in the face.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And what I'm thinking about is coming back to, you know, we've got these two massive prophetic passages in Genesis 3 and Genesis 5 about Jesus' salvation, sandwiching this slap in the face saying, you need to understand how sin is controlling your life.
I think God gave us the power over sin.
Yeah.
Then in verse 8, now I might be taking this a little bit too far, but tell me, I just feel like the symbolism in all of this is really strong. And when I look at, and while Cain chooses to invite, it's almost like he deceives his brother into coming with him into the field. And then he attacks him and kills him. And I sort of think to myself, haven't we all done that in some way to someone in our lives? Because to get our own way, we'd actually drawn them in and then symbolically killed them to get our own way.
It's really this picture of our rebellion, isn't it?
It is.
Like I kind of pictured said, like how when someone gets blessed and we don't, how jealousy can arise in your heart.
Yes.
That's like Cain was jealous.
Oh, yeah.
Jealousy, and we just got to be careful of that, haven't we?
Because it can lead to death in relationships. And, death for us in God.
So I want to come to the other big question, because some of the big questions has been around, we've talked about some people interpret it as God made lots of humans, and if you're reading it that way, how does, we all inherited sin from Adam work, and how does salvation work if we're trying to make that argument? And we've also got this thing about Cain's wife, which has really been sticking with me. And I want to read verse 14 because I think there's a big spiritual thing we can get out of that when we ask that question. So verse 14, it says, Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me.
Yes. What did he say? Everyone. There was only Abel and Cain.
Yeah. Why did he say everyone? Yeah. So on one level, I wonder if this is meant to be a spiritual thing for us, because, if we are sinful and we are driven out from God and we are a godless people, how do we manage without slaughtering each other? How does slaughtering each other not become a thing? So I wonder if this verse is meant to be indicating that there's lots of people, or if it's meant to be indicating our own condition of how chaotic life is because of the absence of God.
Could be both, because
it could be.
Well, what I thought of, like, the first two verses says, okay, Cain came into the world, then she had Abel. Then it goes back when they're in adulthood. And I noticed, like, if you go back in the Generations, chapter 5, none of the women are mentioned. So we must presume that there was women born as well after Abel. Because in verse 4 in chapter 5 it says, and the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters, plural. Now, we don't know when these sons and daughters were born, and we don't know how many. And apparently I read a Russian woman had 74 children.
Yeah.
Or 72.
Yeah, this is possible.
Book of Records. And I thought, wow, one woman having that many children. And then I was at work one night and talking about this Mexican woman, and they were complaining because all her children were there, and she had something like 40 children. So it's quite possible if Eve was absolutely physically perfect. And I'm only talking about looks and figure. Physically perfect. She could pop out 50 odd children or 40 children without too much hassle. And because there's no genetic mistakes.
And as Christians, I think we do need to believe in the possibility of the supernatural. I was joking with someone a while ago about, Jonah being swallowed up in the belly of the fish. And I was like, well, our God could create a giant goldfish that could do that. That's possible. Why do we put limits? But I think another way of looking at it is it possible that this is representing all of humanity's rebellion against God? That we all rebel against God.
So we've gone in the ways of Cain.
Yeah, we've all gone in the ways of Cain. So the word for that is, when we're teaching English, we call it an archetype. So for superheroes, Superman is an archetype of superheroes. All superheroes have something in common with Superman, in that they all have powers and they all try to save people. And Cain, so Adam and Eve and Cain, they're all archetypes for humans, that just as they have committed violence and they have rebelled, we also commit violence and rebel.
Because Adam, I think 2 fortnights ago, you were touching on the topic of man and Adam. And, when God created man, it's not clear, were there many men? But Adam and Eve were invited into the garden. So, to me, it's not clear at this stage how that all fits. But once they were in the garden and the sin with the rebellion occurred, that's when it all changed.
Yes.
Yes, I often wondered too, like when they were in the garden before sin, how long were they actually there? Because they're basically outside of time, weren't they?
Was it? Yeah.
So,
I'm guessing so.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't know death.
Yeah.
They kept eating of the tree of life and death. So that could have been, we don't know, could have been 1,000 years. Could have been one day.
I want to point out a few other things that are in this chapter that might mess with our heads a little bit. So verse 2, we talked about Abel was a shepherd, right? Let's have a look at verse 20. It says, and Adar bare Jabal, he was the father of such as dwells in tents, and of such as have cattle. So, talking about sheep. So I've written down like something in this section is that humanity is still creating, and it's talking in these verses, different people are inventing different things and are inventing, you've got Jubal who created the harp and the organ, Zilal who was instructor of brass and iron. So it's talking about the inventions and the things that humans are creating over time. So if you're reading this literally, Abel was a shepherd 4 generations or so before shepherds existed. Because Jabal was the one that invented being a shepherd.
Do you think that meant it was talking about husbandry?
Could be.
I think it's what occurred to me was maybe that Abel was kind of taking on that role that Adam had in tending for the animals in the garden, and that's sort of and that's sort of also why his sacrifice was pleasing to God, because he was sort of carrying on the task that came from the garden, whereas Cain was working with the curse, and so I don't know if shepherd's the word in my version, but that's sort of what occurred to me, is that there's probably a bit of lineage there in terms of naming the animals and looking after the animals and the garden, and then Abel sort of took on that sort of role.
That's really good. I like that. I like that idea that, Adam was naming the animals and then Abel's stepping into that. That's coming into that idea of Cain's under the curse and Abel's what we were meant to be.
I don't know if that answered your question about that.
No, it didn't, but it was a really interesting comment.
It made me kind of think, why do we like pets?
Yeah, true.
Doesn't most people like a pet?
Yeah.
He made the image of God and he loved them.
Yeah, that's right.
Adam was around with animals.
Yeah.
You could say that the opposite. You could say, why do people like gardening then?
Yes.
Well,
people like
see,
gardening.
I went the opposite.
Well, I suppose you've got an argument there, haven't you?
So I went the other way. I went, why do people hate eating vegetables?
Well, originally they tasted great.
That's right. That's right.
Wouldn't it be nice to have a garden? You wouldn't have to worry about fruit going rotten.
There's a lot of work that garden.
Yeah. So I want to also draw our attention to verse 17, which is also very interesting. It says, and Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So once again, we've got the question, how could Cain create a city if it's only Adam, Eve, Cain and Abel? How is a city possible?
Obviously, he must have had other children.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because at the end, after it sort of goes through Cain's sort of descendants. And 25, that's when it introduces Seth.
Yes.
So it's almost as if Adam and Eve haven't had any more children during that time until Seth arrives to replace.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've got a son to replace Abel.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
well, especially they lived for 900, 800 years, so.
Yeah, I guess just in terms of reading this, if you were going to read this chronologically, you've sort of got Cain, Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel thing, over Cain, and then Cain's wife, and then he has all these kids with this wife, and then Adam and Eve's son Seth. But that's, obviously they might not have been intending to write chronologically. Because
that's one of the things, is that the ancient Hebrews don't always think in chronology. It's not, or doesn't have to be in.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Like, when you think about it, for the children that Adam and Eve must have had, there's really very little written about it. Like, Cain obviously must have married his sister. I wonder what the gap was in between the two.
Well, this is where I want to bring us to something else, because we've got to remember the question, because it's about asking the right questions sometimes. In Rabbinic Judaism, they talk about learning by questioning. And they'd spend hours just questioning each other and trying to find the right question. So Cain building a city, in ancient Near East, usually cities were associated with particular gods. So if a king was commissioned to build a city, it was done for a particular god. And what I've noticed here is the absence of that. Cain's building a city. God said, you're going to be a wanderer. And Cain's like, nope, I'm building a city. Yeah. And then we have the descendants of Cain and everything they're doing. And I'm wondering if the picture here comes together in verse 26, where everyone is everyone rebelling against God? Because you've got in between, so first there's Lamech, who's like, Lamech said unto his wives, and Lamech said unto his wives, I have slain a man to my wounding and a young man to my hurt. So he's killed a guy. And then he says, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. And so we've got this progression of Cain is told he's a wanderer and he says, nope, stuff that, I'm building a city. It's not dedicated to God, it's dedicated to his son Enosh. Or is it Enoch? Enoch. And then after that, we've got Lamech saying, well, I've killed a guy, I've got 2 wives, and it's being bold about it. And then what's the result of that? For the people who are holy, because, Seth is replacing Abel, so now Seth is this image now of the holiness and the people of God. And men, it says at the end of verse 26, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So the bigger picture here is that it's this picture of humanity who are choosing to stay under this curse, choosing to rebel against God, choosing to be evil, and the people like Seth, who are acknowledging that they're sinful, calling out to God and saying, God, what's happening? And then what do we have right after that verse? We have chapter 5, which is that whole message that talks about Jesus coming.
So in 5, just reading ahead, there's a lot of overlap in these names.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Like Lamech, Enoch.
Enoch and Enos.
Yeah, very similar name. And then
Methuselah.
and Enoch was the seventh from Adam. And Lamech was the ninth.
So there's probably a lot of other messages in there because I think the names are always intentional.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot in there that we haven't unpacked. In Genesis 10, there's another set of names, and those names are very interesting because every single name in that list corresponds to a country that existed at the time of it was written. Because that's, I can't remember if it's just before Babel or just after. I think it's just after Babel, or it might be just after Noah's
Before
flood.
Babel. Yeah, just after the flood.
Yeah, after the flood. And I was watching a video by a person who's actually not a Christian, but he was just showing how every single name in the list, and he just mapped it out. And he mapped out the ancient world, essentially, the entire known world. So one of the ones that stood out to me, because I was studying at the time, was in Genesis 10, there's a person named Jarvid. And Jarvid was a name that was used for the ancient Greek people.
Oh, Jarvid, yeah.
And I think Gomer was another one, which messes with my head because I think of Gomer Pyle, and that's just like, that's just the wrong image. But I think Gomer was a name for, did you just say Celts?
Yeah, Celts.
So even further northern Europe.
Yeah.
And all of those names in Genesis 10 refer to a nation. So it does make me wonder what the significance of all these names are in Genesis 4.
Quite interesting. So there must have been a gap then, like you said, between Cain and Seth.
Yeah.
Must have been a gap.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
I'm going to start asking questions.
Go for it. Yeah.
Is there a case for Seth to be seen somewhat as an archetype of Jesus there? Because it comes after all this stuff where Cain has instigated rebellion. And then it says, and Adam and Eve, God gave them a son called Seth. And at that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. It's almost like, once again, God comes in and goes, guys, stop it.
Yeah.
Here is an answer for you. You know, here is my way. And he offers them another way instead of going down that path.
Yes, definitely. That comes into messianic prophecy. This idea that all of these people that are Messiah figures are meant to give us different aspects of who Jesus is. So David as the king gives us a bit of a picture of Jesus. Moses as a person who talks to God face to face gives us a bit of a picture of Jesus. And I like that idea that Seth might be giving us a bit of a picture of Jesus there.
Because then when people call upon the name of the Lord.
That's a good question.
That's a good question, yes, excellent. Well done.
And I feel like after studying this, I'm left with more questions than answers.
Well, I found very interesting here. When I was at school, we was taught that mankind originally was very backward and didn't have much knowledge of anything. And here, this is saying like the Iron Age was before the Neolithic Age. They invented organs and instruments. They learned how to do farming. They could build cities. They had iron. Iron wasn't supposed to come into after Samson.
Any experienced teacher will tell you that every generation is getting dumber and dumber.
That's how you refer to it.
It's...
It always boggles me, that's all.
Yeah. And I think that there's probably something going on there, because think about, like, on a spiritual level, you've got verse 20, I think is where it starts. You've got, the land, the cattle and the animals. So Tim was talking about, Abel taking on the role. And then after that, you've got harp and organ. So I'm thinking about, is this related to, the cattle is about that role that we should have had of looking after creation, and the harp and organ, worshipping God, and, iron, building the temple. Like, that might be a huge stretch. But I wonder what spiritual kind of message might be in there.
One thing that really spoke to me a long time ago was the part there, I think it's verse 8, where it says Abel's blood was crying out from the ground.
Yes.
Yeah, verse 10. And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood cried out unto me from the ground. And I realised in Leviticus chapter 17 it says, I've put the blood upon the altar, and the blood is atonement, and the life is in the blood, and I put it as an atonement upon the altar. And I realised even today we're finding out the blood of people is the main life stream of that person.
Yeah.
That even when we die, our blood can cry unto the Lord.
And I think especially early in the Bible, you don't have a concept of soul yet in the earliest chapters. And it's almost like the blood is taking that kind of position there.
Yeah.
It's like
the mind, the soul, and the blood. It's like it's a triune thing.
Well, I'm hoping that as we've gone through these chapters, it's really unlocking spiritual ways of thinking that we haven't considered before. Because I think one of the droughts in the church is kind of just understanding how the word just brings life into us, and how to read it so that it brings life. And especially in the first 4, 5, 6 chapters of the Bible, where we kind of get our Western mindset on, and we filter out all of the spiritual nuggets that are in there. Someone else that I was reading made mention of the fact in the Bible, why doesn't it say the God of Abraham, Abel, and Noah? It always says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for Jewish people, the historical start of Judaism starts with Abraham. And Abraham is seen as the founder of the faith. I read a book once called Abraham, 3 Wives, 4 Religions. And Judaism, Christianity, Baha'i, and Islam they all look back to Abraham as the starting of their religion, not Adam. And what I think is really significant there is that the ancient Jewish people, the first 11 chapters of the Bible, was seen as this, they believed it to be historical, but the emphasis was the spiritual significance of it. Because from a historical perspective, they thought of their history starting from Abraham, not from Adam. And it's like our spiritual story starts from Adam. Our spiritual, where we have gone wrong as humans, starts from Adam. Where we struggle with sin starts from Adam. And I think that's just been a distinction that has really inspired me to say, to think about what is happening on the spiritual level in the story of Noah. What is happening in the spiritual level on the story of Babylon. And maybe we can just end off with a great, end the term with a video from the Bible Project. Just because I love the Bible Project. Anyone who teaches Bible Project is just a gem.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I can kind of just turn my laptop around. And I find it really interesting that they've, basically it's a summary. They've done a summary of the entire Bible in graphic form, in video form. And they're not telling the story, they're explaining basically the main themes in the story in each section of the Bible.
The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the human seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now right here the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed, or a descendant, will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head. Which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with the great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first, and the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. And these stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
So good, isn't it?
Very good.
They put it so well.
He said it well, didn't he?
Yeah.
How like history repeats itself.
Yeah.
Seriously.
I think there's probably a message about climate change in there somewhere.
About being good stewards. Oh dear. I reckon that there's been lots of doomos in that. Lots of power to that. So I'll probably work out the next date for a masterclass after the holidays. So I don't know how I'll do that. I'll have to talk to Brad when he manages to find a way back to Australia. But yeah, I'd like to pray over us. Just that the word can just be living. Lord, I thank you so much that you care about us. I thank you so much that your message of salvation is just so amazing throughout the scriptures, and that every time we read, there's something new and powerful that can change our lives and can change our relationship with you. I just pray that you'll help us to come to terms with what these stories mean for our daily life. Help us come to terms with what it means to be people who are sinful but also loved by you, to be in a broken world where you are giving us grace. In your name, amen. All right.
I feel we should pray for those that are sick.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. Lord, I just want to pray as